Ladies and gentlemen, hello, whether you're watching L24 English News Edition, streaming live from the capital Algiers, and coming up next in our news program. Algerian President Abdelmajid Tebboune reiterated Algeria's efforts to support the neighbors and African countries in their fight against terrorism. Tunisia called on the European Union to understand the particular stage the country is going through and adopt a responsible speech about what is happening in the country. And still going on, protests flooded the streets and cities across France for the 10th day against Macron's deeply unpopular pension reform. On Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russian forces are moving forward in eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut despite fierce resistance and have almost taken full control of metals over there. Hello again and welcome. I'm your host Abdurrahim Kashur, and those were today's top stories. The President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, said on Tuesday that Algeria was continuing in the same spirit its effort to support the neighbors and African countries in their fight against terrorism and violence extremism, guided by its bitter but successful experience. Mohammed Khatou.
Addressing the participants in the debate of the high-level segment of the Security Council on the fight against terrorism and violent extremism, President Tebboune highlighted the terrorist threat that has been besetting Africa in recent years, stressing that the African continent has become, over the last decade, more affected than any other region of the world by this scourge. The President of the Republic highlighted on the occasion Algeria's experience in the fight against terrorism back in the 90s, describing it as bitter but crowned with success. President Tebboune evoked in this regard Algeria's initiatives, including the development of a new action plan for the AU in the field of the fight against terrorism, the activation of the African Fund for the Fight Against Terrorism, and the implementation of the African Arrest Warrant, among others. While reiterating Algeria's constant commitment to pursue its efforts to implement the continental mandate it is entrusted with in terms of preventing and combating terrorism and violent extremism, President Tebboune expressed his aspiration to strengthen Algeria's contribution in this area and in many others through its candidacy for the post of non-permanent member of the Security Council for 2024-2025.
On Tuesday, the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, had a phone call with his Italian counterpart, Sergio Mattarella, during which the two parties discussed bilateral relations and issues of common interest, indicates a press release from the Presidency of the Republic. The press release also indicated that the two presidents discussed the next meeting of the 9th edition of the high-level forum for the dialogue in the Mediterranean, and specified that President Tebboune has accepted the invitation of his Italian counterpart to take part in the next edition. With the presidency still, Algerian President Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune received on Tuesday a phone call from the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. A statement from the Algerian presidency said the Turkish president expressed good wishes to the Algerian president and the Algerian people on occasion of Muslim holy month of Ramadan. Erdogan also thanked Tebboune for the solidarity and support for the Algerians displayed following the February 6 deadly earthquake in southern Turkey. The Minister of Foreign Affairs and National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf, had received a phone call from the Libyan counterpart Najla Al-Mangoush, with whom he reviewed bilateral relations and means and ways for their consolidation in addition to the latest development at the regional level. Both parties also exchanged views on how to overcome the obstacles that hinder the political settlement of the Libyan crisis. The Algerian diplomacy chief reiterated Algeria's permanent solidarity with Libya in consolidating its unity and reaching consensus on the organization of free and transparent elections that will put an end to the division. In Libya still, the UN envoy to Libya, Abdullah Batili, is continuing his efforts to hold election in the country this year, meeting with the political and military leaders to find solutions to the ongoing political crisis. Hussein Burkan on What Follow.
Abdullah Batili has been holding meetings with political and military leaders in Libya, urging them to fulfill their obligations towards the Libyan people by holding elections within a clear time frame. The UN envoy praised the recent meetings of the 5+5 military committee and called on the Supreme Council and the House of Representatives to work towards holding elections. There are signs of hope that elections could be held this year, after more than a decade of political turmoil in the country. Batili has been meeting with a range of Libyan stakeholders, including security and military leaders, to build confidence and find solutions to the crisis.
They have to deliver on this in a timely manner. Of course, if they don't do it, they will be accountable to the Libyan people, to the international community, to the regional leaders who are supporting them in this process. Of course, if they don't really deliver, we will look at what alternative will be found.
Despite skepticism among some Libyans about the willingness of the House of Representatives and High State Council to deliver on their commitments, Batili remains hopeful that progress can be made towards holding elections.
Stakeholders I have been engaged have shown their skepticism about the capacity or the goodwill of HR and the SCS to deliver on their mandates. Of course, this has to be taken into account, but they have given their words to the Libyan people.
If all goes according to plan, 2023 could see political and security breakthrough in Libya, with parliamentary and presidential elections giving millions of Libyan voters a chance to shape the future of the country.
Permanent representative of Algeria to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Ambassador Lazhar Swalem, said that the Sahrawi refugees in Algeria and in some neighboring countries are victims of the lack of their legitimate rights to 40 years, especially the right to self-determination.
Concerning refugees who sought asylum in my country, I would have loved if we asked ourselves why are there refugees and who made them. The refugees in my country are victims of the denial of execution of international law, and we have been hearing here in this room for a year a reminder on the fundamentals of the UN Charter, international law, respect of borders, people deportation, and I can cite many more. The majority of Sahrawi people who are waiting for the right to self-determination seek asylum in my country and in neighboring countries.
African nations called on the world Tuesday to pay attention to how terrorism targeted their continent, particularly its Sahel region, telling the United Nations Security Council that Africans made up nearly half the world's terror attack victims. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, during the Security Council meeting on counter-terrorism called for by Mozambique that he is deeply concerned by the gains terrorist groups are making in the Sahel and also elsewhere.
The 2022 Global Terrorism Index shows that Africa contributes with about 48% of terrorism-related deaths, and the Sahel region is a new epicenter for terrorist attacks. On the African continent level, terrorist groups have acted with more incidents in North Africa, the Sahel, Central Africa, the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. In the Southern Africa region, the Republic of Mozambique is a direct target of terrorist attacks.
No age, no culture, no religion, no nationality, and no region is immune. But the situation in Africa is especially concerning. Despair, poverty, hunger, lack of basic services, unemployment, and unconstitutional changes in government continue to lay fertile ground for the creeping expansion of terrorist groups to infect new parts of the continent. I am deeply concerned by the gains terrorist groups are making in the Sahel and elsewhere.
In Africa, still, Tunisia called on the European Union to understand the particular situation and stage the country is going through and adopt a responsible speech about what is happening in the country. Tunisia's position was expressed by Foreign Minister Nabil Ammar in his meeting on Monday with the EU Economic Affairs Commissioner, who is on a working visit to Tunisia. In the same line of thought, following his meeting with Tunisian Prime Minister Najla Bouden, European Commissioner for the Economy Paolo Gentiloni stated that the European Union is ready to offer support to Tunisia in its negotiations with the International Monetary Fund. Paolo noted that completing the program with the fund would pave the way for financial and economic support from Europeans towards Tunisia.
Il s'agit de travailler ensemble.
The European Commission is ready to consider providing additional financial assistance if the necessary conditions are met. The first condition is the adoption of a new financing program by the International Monetary Fund. It is necessary that this be done as soon as possible.
A day after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hit the pause button on his coalition signature plan to overhaul the Zionist entity's judiciary, hundreds of protesters once again took to the streets as Ben Gvir makes the crisis a pressure card to the biggest winner.
Zionists mostly expressed relief, but not all were happy on Tuesday as hundreds of protesters once again took to the streets. Mass protests have been staged across the so-called Israel over the past 12 weeks, since the unveiling of the judicial reform plan coinciding with the launch of Netanyahu's racist and fascist government in its tendencies. Zionist parties condemned the agreement of the Prime Minister with the National Security Minister, who's convicted of terrorism charges, and who reiterates his support for Netanyahu in his temporary retreat from judicial legislation in exchange for forming a so-called National Guard under his command. The postponement makes Ben Gvir the biggest winner, as he made the crisis a pressure card, beset by unprecedented nationwide protests as his nationalist religious coalition's signature plan to overhaul the judiciary. Netanyahu pressed the pause button and called for compromise talks with the centre-left opposition, who accused him of selling internal security in return for remaining in power, and said it is forbidden to form armed brigades under the cover of the law. Ben Gvir himself said that he agreed to remove his refusal to suspend judicial legislation in return for Netanyahu's commitment to submitting it again for endorsement in the next session of the Knesset. The opposition, citing the continued presence of the highly contested bill on Parliament's lineup, threatened to boycott any talks should it proceed. Questions remained about Netanyahu's credibility, including within his own camp, after discord by some senior party colleagues. Critics say the judicial overhaul threatens the independence of the courts. Netanyahu, who is on trial on corruption charges, denies it, saying the reforms balance out branches of government.
In the Middle East still, the funeral of the Palestinian man Umair Mohammed was held yesterday, Tuesday, in the city of Nablus. Medical sources declared that Mohammed was dead as a result of his wounds after Zionist forces attacked the city of Nablus last February, in which the occupation forces committed a massacre where 11 citizens were killed and 20 others were injured. Amnesty International, a leading international rights group, on Tuesday criticized what he said were double standards by Western countries that have rallied behind a strong response to Russian invasion of Ukraine but remain lukewarm issues of human rights violations in the Middle East. The sharp rebuke came as the Lebanon-based, or rather London-based watchdog launched its annual report at a news conference at its office in Beirut, Lebanon's capital.
That we witnessed in the last year is really the double standards with which the international community has dealt with the Ukraine crisis on the one hand and the Middle East on the other. And this was especially apparent in the way that they immediately opened their borders to receive refugees from Ukraine. When we contrast that with the experience of migrants and refugees from Libya, from Syria, from Lebanon even, from Syria to the West, we see a very big difference in the way that they've dealt with both sets of refugees.
Now to the European continent, protests flooded the streets in cities across France for the 10th day in a row in face of Macron's deeply unpopular pension reform. More about these Paris rebellions in this report by Marim Zian.
Anger at French president's unpopular pension reform showed no sign of letting up as the nation braced for a 10th day of demonstrations. 450,000 people, according to the CGT, and 93,000 people demonstrated in the capital, according to the police. Numbers that reflect unprecedented unrest in the country. Clashes erupted between protesters and police in several cities, including Rennes, Bordeaux, and Toulouse. Protests and strikes have paralyzed major services in the country. Train tracks and highways were blocked. Public transport in the capital was disrupted. The energy sector and aviation were also affected. In the face of these ongoing strikes and protests, the government spokesperson said the president would be happy to speak with unions directly.
First of all, we don't necessarily need mediation to speak to one another. We can speak directly to each other. The President of the Republic has said that he is ready to meet with the trade unions as soon as possible, because we respect the institutions. The Constitutional Council renders its decisions on the conformity of the text of the law. Beyond that, the Prime Minister is at the disposal of the unions to receive them very directly, to be able to talk.
The current scenario is only making matters worse for the French economy and portrays the sign of a deep socio-economic division across the old continent.
A man stabbed 2 people to death and wounded several others at Muslim center in Portugal's capital, Lisbon, on Tuesday before he was shot, wounded and taken into custody. According to reports by Portuguese police, officials said that the motive behind the attack at the Ismaili Center in Lisbon was not immediately clear. To the conflict in Ukraine now, Russia claims for the first time to have shot down a US-supplied guided smart bomb weapons capable of doubling Ukraine's battlefield firing choice. Nabil Khazini tackled the story in this report.
This is the kind of the smart bomb fired by Ukrainian forces Russia says it has intercepted. The US-supplied ground-launched small-diameter bomb is one of the weapons that could double Ukraine's battlefield firing range. It comes as Ukraine has obtained the first British Challenger 2 main battle tanks. They were received with a thumbs-up from the Ukrainian Defense Minister.
Thank you very much from Ukraine to the United Kingdom.
At the same time, a pro-Moscow official said the Russian forces are edging forward in the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. Russia and Ukraine have spent months locked in bitter combat over the city, a battle both sides have described as a meat grinder, where the front line has barely moved. Not very far, in the Russian-held city of Donetsk, Russia said Ukrainian forces killed 2 civilians when they shelled an apartment building.
It is sad. The situation is very tense. It all seems like it'll never end. Very loud. And it's very scary to live like this.
While Ukraine is still receiving Western weaponry, Russia's defense ministry said its factories producing artillery rounds and rockets will increase the output of certain items by 7 to 8-folds later this year.
And a different matter now, but still related, the US would be willing to share some nuclear force data with Moscow if Russia were to come into compliance with the New START nuclear arms treaty. White House spokesman John Kirby said on Tuesday, the US has told Russia it will hold some data on its nuclear forces, given Moscow's decision to suspend participation in the treasury. Chinese Foreign Ministry said on Tuesday that comprehensive, impartial, transparent and independent international investigation on the sabotage on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines is of a critical importance to the international community. This comes after the UN Security Council on Monday rejected Russia's draft resolution calling for an independent inquiry into the sabotage last year of the Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia to Germany.
The Chinese side noticed that many members of the Security Council condemned in their speeches the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. And some members also pointed out that the investigation process should be accelerated with a transparent disclosure regime. A comprehensive, impartial, transparent and independent international investigation on this issue is of critical importance.
The Kremlin said it would keep calling an international investigation into explosions that damaged the Nord Stream gas pipelines and the Baltic Sea last year, after failing to win backing for a probe at United Nations. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said everyone should be interested in an impartial investigation in order to find the committers.
Of course, with regret, we believe that everyone should be interested in an objective investigation involving all interested parties, all those who can shed light on who commissioned and perpetrated this terrorist attack. We consider this extremely important. We regret that this initiative did not pass, but of course the Russian side will continue its efforts to prevent this topic from being covered up.
North Korea leader Kim Jong-un visited the National Institute of Nuclear Weapons and was briefed on the state of production in recent years to enhance the country's nuclear power qualitatively and quantitatively. He called for increased production of weapons-grade nuclear materials to boost the country's nuclear arsenal. Chinese President Xi Jinping expressed his support for talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran during a phone conversation with Saudi Arab Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Xi stated that the two countries will firmly support each other on issues related to their core interests and contribute to peace, stability and development in the Middle East. The Saudi Crown Prince appreciated the Chinese initiative to support efforts to develop good neighborly relations between the Kingdom and Islamic Republic of Iran. In Saudi Arabia, 20 pilgrims were killed and 29 others were injured in a deadly bus crash, according to state television. The same source indicated that there was a technical issue with the bus that led to the accident. Those injured in the crash are receiving treatment in hospital. Now in sport, the International Olympic Committee has recommended that Russian and Belarusian athletes are allowed to compete under a neutral flag, but has yet to make a decision on Paris Olympics 2024. This recommendation only extends to individual athletes, not teams. IOC board also declared it would closely monitor the full implementation of its recommendation, with compliance being an important factor in its future decision on the upcoming summer and winter games. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. For more updates, you can follow our social media platform. And all I can say at the end, حفظكم and good night.